Now, Ray.
Good morning, Mattia, or good afternoon.
Hi.
You just showed up. We're getting started now. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Again, thank you. And we'll do like we did the last time, which is record this session. And then if you received my email yesterday, I put up a little web page with links and everything. And at the end of this session, I'll fix the link so that this presentation will be there as well as your homework. So what are we going to do today? So basically, the day is focusing on the data view editing capabilities that are inside the admin tool. And I think you'll see it's pretty cool how it works. I was always amazed by it when I first saw it. I thought it was pretty cool. So what we're going to do is essentially everything here today is around data view editing. So we have the interface itself. We need to get comfortable with that. Talk about how to add languages, and also somebody could mute. Not sure who was that. On premise. Anyway, and also some simple things that we can do with data views, such as copying and exporting, importing, and how do we make these visible to the curator tool. So if you look at the schedule, session 3 will be a continuation of data view editing, and we'll cover something else as well. But the point I'm making here is that probably in the admin tool, one of the most important things is data view editing. There's other features, some which I discount, and but this is really where, to me, the bulk of the admin tool is its capability to edit data views. So away we go. So first of all, with the homework, I hope you all did your homework. And I thought I had it open. There it is. So hopefully you did this. And if you didn't have a chance to try it yet, you know, at some point, try to go over these exercises. And if you have any questions, just send me an email, and I can answer the question with either a link or a couple of screen captures or whatever to show you what I'm talking about. And I just thought I'd walk quickly through this one, which was, well, the second one was creating a user. And just as a review, let's do that quickly. So I've got up the local host connection, and if I go to users, you see the existing users. And we said the first thing you can always think about in the admin tool is to right click. So in this case, a right click gives me this menu. And then the new user, you fill out this information. And I'm not going to do it all right now, but the main thing here is this first tab. For general, you fill out the user's information. And then you also, I don't know why we put it over here, but on this tab, you have to pick geography. So you do a search, and then let's say I was looking for Maryland, which is where I live. And the reason there are so many in here is because this was a copy of a test database, and it wouldn't normally have all of these, but I'm going to pick this one. All right. And, you know, a lot of this stuff is extra information, which you don't necessarily need to fill out. Same thing with notes. And we mentioned what this was all about. So the idea is that if a user has a web login, they can then use the public website with some features available only to internal users, internal to the gene bank. And so let me pull up an example. I'm going to cancel and pull up, let's say this one here, which is mine. I just double clicked and it popped up. And if I go to web login, you see that it has that information. So that means that I can do this. So where is it? Doing this, I end up having a lot of screens. So again, when I log in, and keep your eye over here, when I log in, whoops. Too many passwords. That didn't work either. Where is that? Not sure. Well, in any case, if I can't remember that password right now, and I could change it, let's do that. Since I have the AT open, make sure I'm in the right place. I'm going to go back to set password here. Okay. And I'm going to put this in. I think I might have just typed this wrong. Now it says it's changed. And I found from experience it's helpful sometimes to just make sure you save it. So I just put something in that other field. Let's go back and see if it works now. Again, look up on the menu. Let's go put work. What's going on? There's also a set password there. No, the Tia gave me a hint, but where is it? Where is it? All right, let's go back again, make sure I'm the right user. There. And there was an opportunity. So set password. This is for that, and this is for the curator tool. When I go into here, set web password. Why is he saying it? Yeah, but
you set your CP password. Yeah.
Yeah. It's too early in the morning. Right. So I did exactly the opposite of what I was trying to show you. So let me go back again. This password on this first screen, the general tab, is for the curator tool. When you go to the web log one, this is the web password. So this is what I was messed up with. Sorry about that. Let's see. Try it again. I try to do some consistency with all the different, whoops, okay. So it says it's changed. And again, I have found sometimes it's helpful to go to this screen here just to get that save button. That's one of these quirks. Until I see that, now let's go back. You all saw the password. Let's see if I typed it right. Yes, okay. And there's tools. So that's the point of that exercise, that your internal staff have this feature. And I didn't point this out. So when you go to there, you can drop in a SQL query. So in the exercise, I was suggesting that you could get the data dictionary. So if I go to this website, under resources, there's a couple places you can get to this, but if you go to this resource page for SQL queries, this particular file here, which I referred to in the exercise, has a bunch of sample queries. And I've already downloaded it, but you would get it through your browser. But here it is downloaded. And this is an expanding library. I constantly put things up here on this. But if I wanted the dictionary, I can take that query, just copy and paste. Whoops. You have to go to the right, where are we? Again. There we go. So I'm in the website, I went to Tools, Web Query, and now I dropped in the query in here. And of course you could write a query, and you also have a way to get queries through here, which I just typically don't use that often, but you execute, and in this case, I've got the current data dictionary, but it had a limit of 1,000 records. So if I up that to 10,000, I will get over 2,000 entries. And that's essentially every data view and every field name that we use in the data view and so on. And you can also download. And the other thing I want to point out, I'll talk about a little bit today later. Maybe I'll come back and keep this up. But you know, in the actual table, the name of the table in this first line here is accession action. The field name is here, but this is what a user sees on the curator tool, and we call that the friendly name. And I'll come back to that later. So that is that exercise, pretty much. Too many things. There, oops. There it is. Okay. The last thing, just before we leave, one other thing about this, let me go back to here. If I were doing a new user, I wouldn't type all this information. Instead, I mentioned this the other day, I would create a cooperative record, and probably when you're adding one user, you might be adding multiple users. So I would create a cooperative record in the curator tool for each of my new potential users. And then once you save those records, if you do a search, it will show up with the names, possible names. So in this case, there are 5 that match that string REI. And then I could create a new record by selecting, saying OK, and it would populate a good part of the fields that you need. So anyway, that's a lot easier. I do this typically when we have a class. I'll put 20 names, make them records, and probably just go from Excel to the curator tool and then to here to give them logins. So back to here. So today I'm hoping that we'll get my part of the presentation finished and have more time at the end so that you can ask questions, and it could be from the last time or this time. But let's get started with talking about data view editing, okay? So we're gonna look at the basics, and right now we're gonna look at some of the characteristics. What I'm going to do, sorry. Is it possible to update? I have a couple of questions. Is it possible to update a GRIN-Global database? I should have said GRIN-Global database without overlaying the curatorial data. I'll look at the chat. I'll give you a second. We didn't really demonstrate running the updater, but do you remember what I said about that? So can you update the GRIN-Global database without overlaying the curatorial data? Excuse me. Yes, no? I don't see any takers on the chat. Your chat has a little cloud logo icon. Surely somebody would take a stab, yes or no? Well, I'll give you the answer. Yeah, yes, it is possible. Yes, Tariq, good, absolutely. So the updater, but this goes into the next question, and what is the critical step? And you all know what the answer is, backup first. And that's anytime you work with databases so that you have a backup, okay? And what group must be the user be in to have access to the admin tool? Anybody? Do you remember which group? And I think this one is actually pretty straightforward. I don't see anybody typing. In this case, if I go to groups, and I don't have somebody set up here. Whoops, I have to give them a name. Let me go back to an existing. Let me go back to somebody. Let's go to this person. Okay, so Tariq says Gene Bank staff. Actually, if I want to go here, and I can double click or go to properties. All right. So with the groups, if a person has admin privileges, they have to be in the administrators group. Okay. A suggestion, when you're testing the curator tool on your administrator, you should probably have multiple accounts. Excuse me. The administrator has so many privileges because you can read or write on anything. So you're better off, if you're testing the curator tool, to get a look at it from the user's perspective, to create yourself a second or third account, and do not put you in the administrator group for that account. And then you can see how things work for other users. So let's continue on. All right. So let's see. Actually, I had a question. I skipped ahead. So what is a data view? All right. It's just a query. It's a structured query. And the thing is, it makes it a query to call to the database so that if you use the query, you don't have to write all that code. So it just makes it easier for users who are not SQL proficient. And then the next question I asked to make sure everybody realizes this. You know, if you've used the curator tool, there's a lot of data views that we use within the curator tool. But this question is, here's the answer. All right. Yes, data views are used by the public website. In fact, quite a few. And in the new release of GRIN-Global that just was released this August, they changed the public website, and therefore they changed quite a few data views. There was a substantial change in the data views used for the public website. And I mentioned the other day, there's some fixes coming out shortly, and they too will be mostly with the public website data views. So data views are used throughout GRIN-Global, not just the curator tool. Oops, let's see. Okay. So right now I'm looking at the data view inside the curator tool. So if you've worked with the curator tool, you've worked with accessions, and you know the accession has a lot of fields, and I couldn't fit it all on one screen easily, so I put it down here as well. Right? So let's take a look at this in some detail. So first of all, the name up here that shows up on the tab by default, the software suggests the name that was given to the data view of this, and I'm going to go to that node. So I'm going to jump down to data views. And when you click on it, it gives you a plus over here. And when you expand it, it has a series of folders. And each of these is a category of data views. So it's or I should say it's the area. So if I open up this one, I'm seeing all of the data views, starting with accession stuff because it's in alphabetical order. And there are quite a few that are considered to be the client. And so when they're saying client, what they're really referring to is the curator tool. The curator tool is a client of the server, okay? But also, the curator tool uses some of these other ones. Obviously, that's being used by wizards, not quite as many. And then lookup tables that you're all familiar with if you've used GRIN-Global. And we'll come back and look at that. So again, these are the different groupings, if you will. There's the ones that are used by the website. And all the website data views all begin with web and then a name. So there's quite a few. And according to my list down here, it says in this database, I have 888 data views. That's a heck of a lot. So let's go back, what we're going to do next. So we'll look at one specific example. So I'm going to look at accession. All right. So I know accessions in client, but if I didn't know that, these are in alphabetical order. So I don't really have to open up this grouping here. I could scroll down, but it's a lot easier if you know where it is. And if you look at mine, it's got a lot of extras. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. The first time you're in a group like this, it will basically load a lot of this for making it easier to switch back and forth, but I did not. I accidentally hit the mouse. This takes about 10 more seconds. Okay, so let me see what I've got here. I was trying to widen this. This grid can be widened. Okay, so the one I'm in is in a lookup table. I don't really want that. Let me get back up to where I want it to be. So there's accession. See how it didn't take us long now. So I'm looking with the data view editor at the data view called get accession. And I'm going to come back to this top part later. What I first want to do is talk about the bottom part, because that's really pertinent. This part here and over in the top right really are referring to this data view. This is a strange interface at first because this stuff here under source table and fields has nothing specifically to do with the current data view that I'm looking at. But this is the code, this is the SQL code that makes this data view work. Now, I'm not here to teach you SQL. Some of you know SQL, maybe some of you don't. But I like looking at this sometimes because you can look at this and figure out what this data view is doing. And as an administrator, you can look at it here, or you can just copy. I can do a Control-A and copy, Control-C, and paste it into a text editor, and then look at the whole thing that way and get the picture for what the data view is doing. Okay. Now down here are the, if you look, there's the first field, accession ID. All right. DOI. Let me widen this. These can all be widened. All right. There's the three parts to the accession identifier, part 1, part 2, part 3. If I go back to the curator tool, let's look at the accession. So remember, we call it the prefix, but if I highlight it, if you look at the rollover tip, it says it's accession number part 1. This is accession part 2, accession number part 3. Okay. And each field is defined here. So when I go to cross, let's look at DOI, for example. Okay. DOI was a field that was added to the tables maybe about 2 years ago. And it's kind of interesting because the USDA is obstinate. They're still not using DOIs. If I look at their data, they're not in there. but the rest of you guys, for the most part, are putting in DOIs. So what kind of field is it? Well, it's in the table, the exception table. The reason that A is there in parentheses is because in the SQL code, they're basically giving an alias to the table. And again, we're not here to really learn SQL, but that from statement from exception A, that's why that A is there. It's taking exception and then giving it an alias A. And the reason they did that is because they have other tables, and so they use other aliases for the other tables. But anyway, that's getting into SQL. So if I scroll to the right, the field that's in the table is the DOI field. And it says it's not required. And so these columns here, there are 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. The first one indicates whether something's required or not. Let's go back to here. All right. To see this, I'm going to go into edit mode. Now it's interesting, where's DOI? Whoops. Let's go back and look at this. I'm looking here and I'm trying to figure out why that's not showing up in that accession data view. One of the things I wanted to point out about and I want to come back to that question. I'm a little bit confused what I'm seeing right now. But of these 5 columns, this visible in the CT, this does not really work. And I think I have a note here. So if you don't want something visible, you can remove it by taking it out of the SQL. Generally speaking, all the fields that are up here in the select statement will be visible to the curator tool. And I was playing around with this and I was talking to Kurt about this, and they've never really tested it in the sense of why doesn't it work? It just doesn't seem to work. So again, if you didn't want to show certain fields, you could remove them from the SQL. And then if this is one, I'll talk more about this, but the auto synchronize, it would remove that field. So for instance, I'll do that now just to show you what I'm talking about. So it took a couple seconds, but it removed that field from down here. All right. And that's because this was turned on. If that had not been turned on, then this SQL would not match this, which usually you want this to be one. But anyway, I'm going to cancel. I've done so many things to this database. Yes, so you have changes, you know, so you want to save them now. No. And let me open it again. And you can double click or right click and open. So it didn't save my changes, so I'm not going to make any changes to this one right now. And for good reason, I'll talk about that. Now, the other thing that's kind of unique to the curator tool and the GRIN-Global data views is there really should only be one primary key. And some people over the years found issues with that when they had another field that they labeled as a primary key. But there should really only be one, and it's usually this top field, the ID field. That's the way it was defined in the database as the primary key, and that's what it's picking up when it looks at it at the data view editor. Okay. Read only. It does, in this case, some of these fields are coming from other tables, so that's why the plant name and the geography ID are labeled as read only. And it was really generated when the SQL was put together. And you see this when you're in the curator tool. Anytime you see a gray field, that's a read-only field. Okay, and that's because in this case, the name field is coming from the plant name, accession inventory name table. All right, and origin is getting the information from a geography ID. So a lot of this stuff, when it's read-only, is not in the primary table, but it's coming from somewhere else. All right, and again, it's generated by the code that decides if it's read-only usually. All right. So you don't, you can change these, but I'm going to show you some other things about changing read-only when we do some other things. So let me get back to where we'll make sure I'm not skipping something. So we were looking right now at this first of 5 tabs. We're going to walk through each of these tabs, and we're looking at the Fields tab. Okay. So one of the things I didn't mention out, and this is one of the reasons why I do these slides, so I don't forget to tell you something. So basically, when I'm looking in this grid for the fields, the name, the table, and the field, let's go back. All right. For the most part, the name and the field are identical. The only time they typically differ is for like calculated fields, and I think accession, yeah. So here's an example. There is no accession ID string field in the database. If you went into SQL Server Management Studio, you would not find a field called accession ID string, right? So that's why it says none under field. These are fields in the actual table, and there isn't one. But up here, it's generating this accession ID string by the SQL. And so that's, again, just what that means. Okay, let's go back. So we have already talked about these 5 fields, and I want to mention there's a couple notes here. Visible in CT, typically don't even pay any attention to that column. Read-only works fine. We mentioned primary key. And the transform, if we go back, this last column, transform, it's very rare that that's ever used. And let's see. Well, there's, I thought I had a note here. I'll come back to it, but there is one example. It's a web data view that uses transform. So the next thing is to take a look at these different boxes. So in the Fields tab, let's look. There are 5 different kinds of boxes, from text boxes, check boxes, date time, lookup picker. And really, I think it's pretty intuitive when you look at this. So let's start at the top again. Let's look at what would be a good one. Let's look at accession number part 1. So if I click there, as I scroll to the right, I can see information. So it says it's a text box. There's no source. In other words, this is the data that the user had put into that field, and either when they're creating the record in the curator tool, or if they're pulling up an existing accession record in this case, that's just text. And it doesn't tell you here how the text is defined. So we could find that information in the data view editor. I'll kind of jump around a little bit here in my presentation, but up in here, this is kind of interesting. Let's see. Juan Carlos said he does not see all my screen. Let me just check. Are the rest of you seeing the screen? Because I'm looking at it in another computer. Is anybody having a problem seeing the screen? I'm not showing all of the data view editor. I'm showing up right now to lookup picker source, but I'm going to come back and scroll. So let's see, what was I showing? I wanted to show you, if you're trying to figure out, looking at this, it does not tell us how many characters. I could go to SQL Server Management Studio and it would give me the definition for that field. But I also have an ability up here, which is pretty cool. In this box, and again, this has nothing to do with the current data view, but it just so happens they're in alphabetical order and accession is first. If I click on here, it lists all the fields that are in the accession data view. And if I go down, it tells you information. So let's go to this one. There's the actual database name is accession number part 1, which you see here. When I roll over it, it tells me it's a string it's a string field. It's a text field. And that's what this is saying. But this is also telling me how many characters. So I can determine the number of characters in a field without having to go to the SQL Server Management Studio. I can just look at it by picking the name of the data view up here, the name of the table, and then basically looking at the different fields. So DOI, it's a string and it's only 20 characters, okay? The other thing, it's kind of subtle, but there's a difference between the red and the green. So if you look, the red ones, you see what it's showing? Is backed up is a required field. Is core is a required field. So anytime you see a red little icon with a little red area, that's required. The greens are not required. And you can see that if you were actually looking down here at the current data view, because we have required, you know, so like we said, is core is required, right? Is core is required. Okay. So let's go back. So typically a text box, you know, it can be free form, it can be integers only, it can be decimals only, and that's defined pretty much at the database, at the SQL Server Management Studio when you're using that tool. The checkboxes, as you know, are typically for true or false situations, flags where you have two possibilities. And so let's look here for a checkbox. Is backed up. Most of the flags are usually a name like that. Is something. In this case, is backed up. Those fields are typically checkbox fields, and that means that it's allowing yes or no. Kind of a side note, which is unrelated to this admin tool, but you have to be careful about that because users, they can actually import Excel data. And if they're dragging that in, there have been cases where people have dragged in and it wasn't yes or no, but it was something else. And it actually gets into the database that way. I don't think they actually created any kind of trigger for that, but that's a digression. I'm not going to get into that right now. Let's go back to here. Okay. Date and time, I think that's pretty obvious. So the fields defined in the database as a date field, it will be treated that way here as well. The two that I really want to concentrate are lookup picker and drop down. So let's go, when you're in the accession data view, let's go look at taxon. And I'm going to, well, I can get into here. Okay. When I move my cursor, you all that are experienced know the cursor changes, and it's implying, in this case, that it's going to use the lookup window, which they call the lookup picker. In this case, it's taxonomy, and it's looking for a valid taxon. And as I start typing, it's preventing me from putting anything in this field except what's in this lookup table. So in the data view, whenever you have a lookup picker, so what do? We were looking up taxonomy, which was taxonomy species. If I go to the right, you see that the interface, it says it's using the lookup picker. And then if you go to the right, it tells you what lookup table it's using. So in this example, it's using the taxonomy species lookup table. Now you would never want to, probably, I can't see a reason why you would ever change this here, because the SQL that you have here that you're going to put in place will already have defined which lookup table it's going to be using. And again, most of us as GRIN-Global administrators, we inherit the system and we typically aren't making major changes. So I can't imagine that somebody would go into the accession data view and change this to a different lookup picker. But in theory, you could do that. Why? I don't know why. Let's go back to here. So that's illustrating that one. And then the other thing is drop down. So when you have a drop down in the curator tool, like status, let's look at status. All right. So accession status is right there. All right. And if I pretend I was creating a new one, fortunately it jumps. Okay. That's interesting. So the status by default is filled in. I wasn't thinking about that. So in this case, it has the default status of active, but those are the various statuses in this particular database. So in this case, there are 5, although GRIN-Global no longer has 5 statuses when you first load it, when you get a fresh copy from the USDA. And years ago, it only had 1 status, which was inactive. If it wasn't inactive, it was assumed to be active, and it was allowed to be null. But anyway, they've changed all that logic, and now they come up with multiple statuses. At Norton, we learned the hard way. We were doing it in class, and they had changed statuses. They added their own group, and I'm getting ahead of myself. Where does this stuff come from? In the AT, it says whenever there's a drop down, it goes to the drop down source. So let's find status over here. And notice the field says it's a status code. And then it says the user interface is a drop down. And then here's the actual source for the drop down. So it's using a code from the accession status code group. So in this column here, whenever you see these items, these are how you get your drop downs, and they're coming from code groups. And we're going to talk about code groups later in one of the following webinars. How do you change those? It's very easy to do. It takes minutes, and you can add new codes. We recommend it when you first load GRIN-Global, you don't change the code groups. Leave them all in there because they're used throughout the system. But you can certainly change the codes that the code groups use, all right, for the most part. So let's go back. So again, this is just showing status. And in this case, and they all typically, the fields typically have the name code at the end of their field. Excuse me, after an hour, the other computer has to change this. The screen dies. Sorry. Need to change the time to 2 hours. Okay. So anyway, again, the codes are always called code at the end. Now, this is kind of interesting. Languages. Let's go and look at this. As you all know, we talked about this the other day. Is this? There was quite a delay there. In this case, I'm going to widen this a little bit more. And you can see there's quite a few different languages. Right. So throughout the series, I'm going to talk about how you set up languages and how to alter it and so on. But if you have languages set up and the data views have names for the fields, for those languages, they'll show up in these columns. So in this particular database, this database is set up for these languages. This is Czech, and these two come by default, ENG and English. I'll talk about ENG later this series. And then, of course, Spanish, French, and so on, Portuguese. So you never want to get rid of system. You never want to get rid of English. You never want to get rid of ENG. I would recommend that you never get rid of those languages. And I'll talk about that in another lesson, not in today's lesson. But whenever you have these languages, if I wanted to give this status code a Czech name, I can actually do that here. That's one of the things I could do at this point. And I'm going to talk more about this. It's kind of a little bit confusing, but it's picking up these names from two different tables within GRIN-Global. But if you wanted to modify this particular data view, and in this case, I'm working with accession. Let's say for accession that I wanted to change this title instead of saying accession ID to say something, let's say I wanted to put the word accession in all caps. You could do that, okay? So, but usually these are not changed that often because they're already in the database in a file. And I'll show you where that file is later. We're going to do a little exercise in changing it. So moving on a little bit, the parameters, we said this is where you have the variables. And so in this case, for this example, there are 7 different variables that data view can handle. And if I were to look at this actually in the data view editor, you can find these parameters if you kind of look for them. Let me go down into the logic a little bit. And again, we're not here to learn SQL, but there's the parameter. It always begins with a colon, at least it does in Microsoft SQL Server. It begins with a colon and then the name of the field. So in this case, the name of the parameter is accession ID. And in this case here, that's where that's picking that up, okay? Now, to jump ahead a little bit, if I wanted to test this data view, I'll come back to properties and titles. But if I go to preview, all right, and I click on go, there's the list of those same parameters. And if I have a parameter that I know, let's say 1 for the accession ID, all right, and I say go or okay, it just ran that SQL. And when it did, it found a record whose accession ID was 1. All right, now let's do this again. And I can change this, let's say, give me accession, I guess I have 100 accessions. So this is one of the things you can do in the data view editor, is you can do a preview. And if you're getting results here, then the chances are that that data view is going to work properly in the curator tool. If you get some kind of error message here, it's not going to work in the curator tool. So that's really the purpose of this preview tab, is to test your code. And again, on the next lesson, we're going to talk about what you should do with this code. But let me continue, because I'm going a little bit slower than I'd like to. All right. So we talked about parameters, an example, accession ID, and there's the parameter there. Now, the properties tab. This is important. Let's go back to here. All right. So several things here that are really important. First of all, that's the data view name. So when you are in the curator tool, that's the name that shows up for the data view name. But actually, it does and it doesn't, because under titles is the names that have been given, the friendly names. And usually they duplicate the title into the description. Really, it's the title that's showing up. So when I do, let's say, looking at this, if I were looking for another, I need to cancel. When I start a new tab and I pick a data view, those names, that name there, accession action, get accession action, is coming from here. So I'm looking currently at the accession data view, but if it were the accession action, it would have said get accession action. So again, you can change the title of the data view. For instance, why do they use the word get all the time? That's just a convention they came up with. I'm sorry they ever did. I wish they had just left the word get out. So it would just simply say accession. So if you wanted to, you could modify your accession names, your data view names for your entire organization. Let's go back to here. So that the other thing I want to point out is client and area. And I'm going to introduce this idea. If I need to add data in a CT, but the data view doesn't display, the reason is because of this. Let's go back to here. All right. When I look at properties, the only data views that are seen by the curator tool, the categories are limited to just a few. And one of them is client, another is reports. So if you wanted to, and I'm getting ahead, I'll do it through the slides. There's actually a data view that determines what categories are displayed. If you go to the data view list data view, there's some code in there that says the category code client, reports, or anything that begins with the word site, those are visible in the CT. So if you have if you create a data view and you want it visible in the CT, then I would suggest that you make sure the category code is client. So again, back to here, there you see the category, okay? If I went to a different, let's go to system. And I'll pull up app setting. By the way, these data views under system are extremely important because they're, of course, system data views. And I didn't realize it was going to take all this long to do this. When I pull this up, I want to look at the category. And as you can deduce, it says system. It does not say client. So therefore, if you wanted to make some changes within the curator tool, you can't do that, even you as the administrator. So if you want to edit the data and you want to use the curator tool to edit the data, then what you could do is temporarily change the category. So there's all these crazy sites, but you could change it to client. And then it really doesn't matter so much about the database area. But if you change it to client, that will show up in the list of data views to the curator tool. You can make your changes, and then when you're done, change this category back to system. So that's a pretty nice feature. Instead of using SQL Server or running a query as a database person, you can actually edit the data, any of the data, by using the curator tool. So I'm going to actually have you do an exercise about system language. But in this case, here's the example. So I could just change the category, as we just said. And the other thing I wanted to point out was the help. This is kind of interesting, but this is like one of the few places where there actually was information in the built into the admin tool. But under help, it talks about rules for different names, naming conventions. And most of this is still current. Anyway, it's helpful sometimes to look at that. We mentioned transform. I'm not going to go into that. It's not really used except once that I know of in the base of GRIN-Global, and it's used on a particular, it's used on a public website data view. So we talked about the titles, but I think I didn't mention this, that if you actually duplicate a data view, which is what we recommend, if you're going to change a data view, don't just create it, don't alter the original data view, but make a copy. And I'm going to talk about that quickly, shortly. But also change the titles of the duplicate. In other words, right now, I have a problem with my website or my database. When I go to here, let me illustrate the problem. If I pull up, see all these? That's because different accession data views were made and they were never changed, their titles. And so now I can't tell which one is which. I need to clean this up. I keep fooling with it, but I don't go in and clean it up. We talked about the names and how you can find out information. Hierarchy, I didn't talk about that. This is kind of interesting. If I go to this tab here, this gives you the general flow of the hierarchy in GRIN-Global of who's the parent, who's the child. Now, site is up here at the top because site has no dependencies. All right. Here are the fields that are in site. And here are other data views or other tables that use site. So if I open up accession, then you see there are other tables related to accession. If I go to inventory, I mean, we're seeing the hierarchy of the GRIN-Global system. So again, it has nothing to do with the current data view, but it is useful. I'll come back to that. But anyway, that's just something to be aware of. All right, rule number one, right click. All right, so I want to talk about duplicating. And the first thing you can do is export. So if I wanted to export a data view, It's really simple. Let me close this up. All right. I'm going to go back to my list. And let's go back to client. All right. You'll see why I have so many of the same thing. Let's use a different one. Let's say I wanted to perhaps work on the citation data view. Okay. So rather than make a change, what I would recommend is doing this. Right click and export. Now, the data view editor is kind of cool because it remembers the last place you exported the file to. And look what it's doing. It's creating a data view file. It's called .dataview.xml. And as you can see, I've created several of these. So it takes the name of the data view, it adds the year, and then a number to it. In any case, it's distinct. And if I save it, it will put it out there in this folder as a file. So let's do that. And if I ever want to import a data view, I can do this. Now, I'm just right-clicking, and I'm going to import it. And the data view editor is smart enough, it remembers where I was storing these files, which I find to be a nice feature. So if I wanted to import this one, where is it? Citation as today's date. All right, I can select a double click, open. And now, if I bring this in, it's the same name, it's going to overlay. So if you click slowly, or if you hit F2, you can change the name. So what's today's date? 26, 11/26. All right. And I typically am going to leave these check boxes. Import to SQL for SQL Server. That's the only one we're using. Yes. Include all the fields, properties, and parameters. Yes. Yes for language. And just keep this one unchecked. We almost always do it this way. And we click and we say import. So now, there it is. Now it's interesting over here, it's in this list. I don't see it over here. Let's try a refresh. Let's see if this works. There it is. So it took a refresh. So I right-clicked on client and I did a refresh and it did that. Now, two other things about exporting. One of the things I said was, of course, before you ever install a new version of GRIN-Global, to back up your database. But another suggestion is to also back up all of your data views. So if you go up to this data view heading and you say export all, it creates one large, one of those XML files, or data view XML file. And it will take all these data views and bundle them. It's almost like a zip file. And if I look, I'm going to go to import. So I'm not going to do this at the same time, but that's how you would back up your entire set of data views, is to right click on there. If I go to import, it will show me some of the data views that I've created recently. And so it will actually create one. In this case, I did client all. So I picked the category client. In this case, this is all the data views. And if I open that, I'll get a list. So this is how you can a couple things you can do. You can take a list of data views and send it to somebody else. You could just send them that file, and they could import that file through the data view editor and bring in your data views. So this is helpful if you're going from like a test database to a production database, and you're satisfied with the data views the way you have them in the test. Then you could essentially install GRIN-Global for your production environment, and then take this data view, and bring in all the data views that you've been testing and overlay the ones that came by default. So I hope you can see the value in that. So anyway, it's very user-friendly. I think it's very easy to follow, and these slides just have some examples of that, okay? So I've just demonstrated all these slides, okay? And again, we say either hit F2 or gently to kind of like a double click to rename it, so that if you're going to test something before you don't overlay the original. Now, the last couple of slides, and I'm almost done, basically, and I'm going to cover this the next week, so I'm not going to rush into this, but just briefly, it's important, the data views, we have to keep track, or actually we don't have to because the admin tool does for us, but we're going to see how we're going to map the field names and then give them friendly names. And again, I don't want to rush this, so I didn't think I was hoping we might have time for that, but I'm going to stop, I think. And then we'll cover this in the next lesson, which we were going to cover again anyway, because we're going to talk about table mapping. But the last thing here I've got is about copying data views. This is even easier to do than importing and exporting. So if I go back to here, and I wanted to make a copy right now, I can just simply go like here, right click. So I'm on the data view name. Oh, why sometimes it goes through the entire set. I guess the text, and there's been changes. A lot of times, if you haven't moved around as much as I have, it will not rebuild this whole list. But anyway, there's the copy too. So I'm copying the accession, and I can give it a new name. So here's a case where I can say demo Thanksgiving, which is today in the United States. It's a federal holiday, and I spelled it wrong. All right. And there it is. In that case, I put it right there. So I've got I have a duplicate, and then I can have I can make changes to this one, test it in the curator tool. If I like what I'm seeing, I could then rename the other one to a temporary name and give this the original name. So different ways that you can manipulate your data views using this editor. So next week, we'll talk about Monday, how to actually map these data views to the database. And we'll spend more time on the friendly names. So we've got a few minutes left. Let's open this up. If you want to ask the question, unmute, or you could use the chat. I put you guys all asleep. Okay. Yes, Juan Carlos is doing some housekeeping. I sent the invitations. If you haven't received them, please send them an email. So you should have your links for Monday and Friday next week for the 2 days. Sorry for the kind of screwy schedule, but I had to do it that way. So we're going to meet on Monday, and he's got links to that. And I posted the link for today's session late last night, so I will do that also Sunday night. So you could go to the website that I set up. So I'll put the link here Sunday night. So again, I'm going to give you some homework, and ideally you can practice using the data view editor, some of the things that I showed. If you have a copy that you can look at, even to just play around with that interface a little bit, even if you don't make any changes to it, just to look at it. And if you have any questions, send me the questions. Let's see, using PDW as SQL editor, can I modify the data? Public website SQL editor. You're talking about Juan Carlos, I think his question is on the public website. Can I change the data? The answer is absolutely no. If this is what you're talking about, Juan Carlos, where are we? This only allows selecting. It allows no inserts or no deletes. So this is relatively safe. As far as we know, nobody's broken through. The only way you can get to this box is if somebody gave you permission, and then you get to it through tools. But once you're here, you cannot insert and you cannot delete. Sarah asked the question, does the data view editor affect the search tool data views identically to the curator tool? Does the data view editor affect the search tool data views? Sarah, I'm not understanding that. Could you either unmute or elaborate? Does the data view affect? Are you saying that you can use the data view editor to are the search tool and the curator tool point through exactly the same data view? Actually, what is happening is when you're in the search, it's more complicated than that, I think is the answer to your question. So whenever you do something through the search, you're actually communicating with a search engine, which is in the middle tier. So I think what we should do is maybe pursue this questioning offline. You know, you're using the search interface that's does not change, and then the search engine is communicated through the search tool, the program. Why don't you follow through with that there, presentation 2 PDF link returns for presentation 2. Yes, the reason for that, Beth, is I didn't post it yet, but after this presentation, give me 5 minutes and it will be there. Okay. So she's pointing, in fact, well, I can do it as soon as I get off of here, I'll make it live. And I'm glad you asked that, Beth, because that just reminded me of something. This is a general announcement, and yesterday we had an email from a guy in France who had a problem installing the curator tool. And we discovered, because I duplicated the problem, we discovered that in a brand new computer that did not have the curator tool installed yet, when you install it the very first time, as I mentioned in lesson 1, it also downloads a copy of the SAP runtime, Crystal Reports runtime tool, the viewer for Crystal Reports. Unfortunately, we just discovered yesterday that the SAP people, the SAP people, moved the location of the file that the installer downloads. So I'm working with Pete Sear, and I'm not sure if he's going to get it done today because it's a holiday, but maybe he will. We're going to have the file on our website, and he's changing the Curator tool installer. So if anybody tries to install the Curator today, at least right now, and it's on a virgin machine, it's never had the Curator tool installed before, you're going to get an error. And hopefully we'll fix that. And I'll fix, in the meantime, I'm going to, if I don't hear from, that's what happened to me today, Grace, sorry. So what I'll do after this presentation, I will put some language on the Curator tool installation page, and you can find the file that you need. I'll point to that with the link, and then you can do the install. Sorry, Grace, although it's probably nighttime for you, so you might not get to it now. We'll have a temporary fix and a permanent fix soon. Things happen in the dark. Any other questions? Well, Grace, you're very generous. Okay, well, give me about a half an hour and I'll make that fix. So I'm going to do 2 things immediately after this presentation. I'm going to make it live for this presentation from my website that I created. And then the second thing I'm going to do is go over to the GRIN-Global side and put some notes. And what I'm talking about is here. Let me just pull that up. When you go to the this page, where is it? On this installation page, I'll put a link to where you can download the viewer program that you need for Crystal Reports. And then you need to do that first before you install. I'll put a note there. So, and then we'll fix this. Pete said that he'll change the installer file, the exe file, so that it no longer will point to the SAP location, and he doesn't have to rescan that. Okay. So anyway, I thank you again for your patience listening to my gravelly voice, and I hope that you do the homework, and I hope you have a good weekend. Stay safe, and we'll see you on Monday. And if you have any questions, please send me them an email. I'm going to eventually we'll have a document where we have all the questions and answers from this session. So again, thank you for your time, and have a good day or evening, depending on where you are. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you to all of you for coming. I remember the next session 3 and 4, the next week is in Monday, session 3, and Friday, session 4. Thank you to all of you. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Martin.
All right. See you later.
See you later.
See you, Albert.
Carlos. Hello, Carlos.
Yeah, Chamba, we call across to the Skype.
All right.